There's a guy called John Maxwell who writes a lot about leadership. Some of you may have heard of him. And he talks about how in leadership there is a basic rule, which is that if the leader is at this level, the best they can do is to train someone up to about that level. The disciple's never going to be quite exactly the same, unless they really invest in themselves. Now, it's an interesting question. What does that then look like over multiple generations? If the disciple is not actively trying to get as good as the leader, you end up with this gradual decline. So if the original leader's there, the disciple's there, but then that disciple trains someone up to that level, and then to that level. Play that out over 2,000 years, and what happens then? And I think this is just an interesting question for us as a church. So what Jesus is saying here, the disciple is not superior to the teacher, but the fully trained disciple will always be like the teacher. The disciple who is actively invested in their growth will get pretty close. But if we're just passive, if we're just doing the basic, you end up with this decline. And this should really scare us, because 2,000 years later, is our understanding of Christianity the same as what Jesus was presenting? Are we actually being formed in something completely different here? Are the teachers badly trained? If I'm only at this level, I can only lead you to there. Now, this was a question that hit me many years ago. So I grew up Catholic, went to church every Sunday, was part of a youth group all the way through high school, went to Catholic schooling. I got to university, I was 18 years old, and through a series of events, kind of rediscovered my faith. I think God broke in and tipped my life upside down. Now, as part of that, I read a biography of Francis of Assisi. So St. Francis was back around, the 1200s. And what I read absolutely blew my mind, because the way that he knew Jesus and the way that he lived Christianity was so radically different to anything that I'd ever been taught. And that created this curiosity. I went and started reading other stuff. And I actually went and read some stuff from way back in the early church. Some of the stories of the earliest martyrs in the church, people who had sacrificed everything for their belief in Christ. And I remember sitting down reading this book thinking, this feels like a different religion compared to what I was brought up with through Catholic schooling and Sunday homilies. This is foreign to me. I don't understand what these people are talking about. And that kind of scared me, because I thought, well, hang on, what am I doing? If all of my friends are making judgments about whether they live their faith or abandon their faith, but maybe we don't even know what the faith even is. And this kind of started me on this real hunger to learn and go back and read the Bible again, to read the teachings of the church, read the lives of the saints. And what I started to realize was that we've really kind of lost that original vision for discipleship. What Jesus is saying here is this really strong call to mold your life, to shape your life, to imitate him. Now, if I can kind of explain church history really quickly. When Jesus formed the church, it was very dangerous to be a Christian. For the first 300 years of Christianity, it was illegal to be a Christian. You could be killed in the most horrible, bloody ways known to man. If you weren't executed, you'd be sold into slavery. All your possessions would be taken from you. So if you decided to follow Jesus, there was a really intentional decision. You were all in to follow him. Around the 300s, around 313 AD, the Roman emperor has a conversion. Conversion with quotation marks. It's a bit of a complicated story. But that changes the situation dramatically because suddenly Christianity becomes legal and it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And now everyone wants to get baptized because whereas before you were going to get executed, now you're going to get a promotion at work. The whole motivation changes. And whereas before there was a really intense process of preparation for baptism, now there are so many people, we just get them through quickly. And so that standard of what it means to be a disciple drops dramatically. And then as we see over time, it just starts to change more. So whereas originally you had to be prepared to die for Jesus, now you just have to be prepared to live for him. But then we just say, well, as long as you just turn up, fulfill your obligation, come to church. But then in our modern time, even that seems too hard. As long as you just believe in God, that's enough. You don't have to come to church. You don't have to pray. We've sort of lowered the benchmark so far down. And as a result, our whole understanding of God has changed. We've almost turned God into this idea, sometimes gets referred to as buddy Jesus. The Jesus who's your best friend, he doesn't really care about your sin, he loves you anyway. And that's kind of the idea we end up promoting. We've got to come back and say, well, what was Jesus talking about here? He was talking about complete life transformation. A life where you are prepared to invest everything in the thing that's really going to last. Where you're prepared to examine every part of your life because you know that this goal is worth fighting for. Now, I'd come out of a background in sport, and I understood what discipline was. That the whole culture of sport is you discipline yourself, what you eat, how you sleep, how you train. Everything is devoted because you know the end goal. You've got this idea of victory, of glory, and you're prepared to be hard on your body so that you can identify every weakness and correct it. And yet what I discovered was how empty that was. As soon as you get an injury or an illness, after a month, all that you've achieved has disappeared, and you've got to start again. And yet what I saw when I read these early books was the early Christians realizing that the true goal is eternal glory. It's that our life, our hearts can be shaped into a reflection of the love of God. And they devoted the same discipline, the same kind of self-mastery to pursuit of love in the same way that people today do towards, going to the gym or trying to look good. Something which is so vain and so frail, which will always rot. And yet, the early Christians understood that they were investing in something which would never disappear. And this is kind of what Jesus is saying here. To be able to really look at the truth of your heart and then do the hard work to allow that process of conversion. As he says, you can't get figs from a thorn bush. You can't gather grapes from brambles. When I looked at my life back as an 18-year-old, I realized that despite all of the Christian veneer of my life, going to church, going to a youth group, I was just producing thorns. And no matter how much God loved me, I was hurting people. Anyone who came near me was getting hurt by my words. And that's what had to change. My life was not bearing fruit that brought life to other people. And so that really is the goal. That we can come before the Lord and say, change my heart. For all the violence that I speak, Particularly I was really challenged by swearing. As Jesus says here, the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. When I stopped and realized what these swear words mean, and I realized, is that a reflection of what's inside my heart? That has to change. And to then really devote yourself to seeking the Lord in prayer. To not just going through the motions in prayer, pray the rosary, pray the novena, but actually delve into the scriptures. Really pray for healing, pray for transformation. That you can go on a journey of really being discipled by the Lord. And I think this is where we need to come back to. The idea that Jesus uses of discipleship, the image basically means like walking in the footsteps of the Master. That where he walks, you follow exactly the same path. You can't do that unless you are actively reading the scriptures. You can't do that unless you're really reading what a lot of the great theologians and spiritual saints have written about. If you go back to the image I started with about how that level of leadership keeps dropping over time, we're in a position now where we actually have to rediscover how the early Christians lived their faith. The danger we've got at the moment in our church is where we've got a culture where Catholics don't read the Bible and they just rely on the preacher to tell them how to live their faith. But you're presuming that I have got a good level of faith. Hopefully I do. I'm trying. But you don't want to rely on me because you're only ever going to get up to just below where I am. The reason why we've been left the scriptures is so that we can go back to what the apostles wrote, go back to their level. The reason why the church gives us the writings of the saints is because these are people who have lived a life of really radical discipleship. To go back and say, well, what was their benchmark? What did they try and live? Let yourself be trained by them. We need to raise that level for our sake, but particularly for the sake of the next generation. If someone was to come into this church and sit next to you next Sunday and say, excuse me, can you teach me how to become a saint? Would you personally know how to lead them? Would you know how to help them walk away from a life of sin? How to enter into a life of contemplation? If you're at that level, then yes. But if you're down here, you're going to be pointing to someone else and say, go ask them. We need to become that fully trained disciple. And we need to really set our goal on what is really lasting in this world, where everyone is investing in things that are going to fall apart and fail. To set our goal on what is truly eternal. How do we develop a heart that is the very reflection of Jesus' heart? I sometimes think that when we get to heaven, the measure is actually where your heart is going to be held up next to his. To say, okay, are you as loving as he is? Is your heart as pure, as radiant with light as his is? Or is it still filled with junk that needs to be purified? We've got to keep that vision before our eyes. And so every day we can be calling upon the Holy Spirit to do that work in us. That the Spirit can be our trainer, the one who forms us and shapes us until our life bears real fruit that can last.